Good morning from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. I'm Stephen Clark, editor of spaceflightnow.com, and welcome to our live coverage of the launch of a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket carrying ispace's Hakuto-R moon lander into space. This moon lander aims to become the first commercial spacecraft to make a controlled soft landing on the surface of the moon. That's the primary payload on this morning's mission. You're looking at a live view of Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where the Falcon 9 is vertical at this hour, awaiting the start of propellant loading, which is due to begin at T-minus 35 minutes. Launch time this morning is targeted for 2:38 a.m. Eastern Time, or 7:38 a.m. UTC, an hour and 20 minutes from now. The mission will last about 53 minutes from the time of liftoff until deployment of the final payload. I mentioned the primary payload is the Hakuto-R lunar lander, a robotic unpiloted spacecraft that will be attempting to land on the near side of the moon in late April. There is one rideshare on this mission, a CubeSat about the size of a briefcase called Lunar Flashlight. That is a small satellite developed by NASA in partnership with Georgia Tech that aims to test out a laser system to search for signs of water ice at the moon's poles. We'll be bringing you live updates throughout the countdown this morning, as well as throughout the mission profile. Again, 53 minutes from liftoff until final payload separation. The first stage booster will be coming back to landing at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, about 6 miles or about 10 kilometers south of Pad 40 at Landing Zone 2. This is the second of back-to-back return to launch site recoveries of first stage boosters that SpaceX will be performing in a series of just less than 3 days. Back on Thursday evening, SpaceX launched their most recent mission for OneWeb, carrying 40 internet satellites into orbit. And on that mission, the first stage booster also returned to a landing site down at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, Landing Zone 1. That booster is actually still in place down at the recovery area in Landing Zone 1 right now. So SpaceX will be landing this booster at the neighboring concrete landing pad, Landing Zone 2. Landing Zone 2 has been used in the past for the dual landings of the two side boosters of Falcon Heavy rockets. Those come down nearly simultaneously, one on Landing Zone 1, one on Landing Zone 2, just a couple hundred meters apart. But this will be the first time that SpaceX has actually landed a single stick first stage booster on a Falcon 9 mission at Landing Zone 2. So we have a lot to cover over the next hour and 18 minutes leading up to liftoff and throughout the Falcon 9's climb into space. The Falcon 9 will be sending ispace's Hakuto-R lander and the Lunar Flashlight spacecraft for NASA on a trajectory into deep space, on a trajectory to escape Earth's gravitational grip. The two spacecraft will actually fly beyond the moon and then return to the vicinity of the moon early next year to be captured by lunar gravity. This is called a low-energy ballistic transfer trajectory. It's much different than the Apollo missions of old that took just a handful of days to get to the moon. Also different from the Artemis launch profile that some of you may be familiar with. The Artemis 1 mission took about 6 days to get from Earth to the moon. This will take on the order of 4.5 months to make the trip from Earth to the moon. But mission managers and engineers have traded the duration of the trajectory, duration of the mission for fuel efficiency. This is a much more fuel efficient profile for these two spacecraft to reach the moon. And that's necessary because these two spacecraft are relatively small. In the case of the Hakuto-R lander, it's about the size of a golf cart or a compact car, about a metric ton in total payload mass. For Hakuto-R Lunar Flashlight, even smaller, the size of a briefcase, about 30 pounds. And with those small envelopes, small spacecraft can only carry a limited amount of propellant, so it's necessary to take this longer, more fuel-efficient route to the moon. Again, as I mentioned, the next major milestone in the SpaceX countdown is about 40 minutes away with the start of propellant loading. Later in the coverage this morning, we'll bring you some interviews that we've conducted with ispace's founder and CEO, as well as with the principal investigator, the chief scientist working on NASA's Lunar Flashlight mission. If you're just joining us and you haven't done so yet, please hit the like button here on our YouTube stream. That helps us gain a larger audience for our coverage. We want to bring this late night or early morning launch, depending on where you are in the U.S., to as many people as possible. And to help us do that, please hit the like button here on our YouTube stream. The venting you're seeing from the strong back out at pad 40 right now is a customary sight at this point in the countdown. It's one of the pre-tanking operations. This is not indicative of propellant loading already underway. That's going to begin at T-minus 35 minutes. As I mentioned, this venting is just part of some preparations for that propellant loading process. 1 hour, 8 minutes, 40 seconds until the scheduled launch of the Falcon 9 rocket from Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. I mentioned the primary payload on this launch is Hakuto-R. This is called Hakuto-R Mission 1. It's a lunar lander, a robotic spacecraft that's been developed by a company called ispace. This is a privately held company based in Tokyo, founded back in 2010, initially to pursue the Google Lunar X Prize, which was an effort to offer cash monetary prizes to teams, private teams who were able to successfully land on the moon. That Google Lunar X Prize ended a few years ago without a winner, and ispace was able to secure additional funding and pivoted to a new mission objective without pursuing the Google Lunar X Prize, but they maintained the objective of developing a commercial moon lander. This lunar lander is called the Series 1. This is ispace's first mission. This lander has a total launch mass of about 2,200 pounds, or about a metric ton. It's about the size of a compact car, as it's encapsulated inside the payload fairing of the Falcon 9 rocket. It doesn't fill up very much of that payload fairing volume. With the 4 landing legs extended, those landing legs will actually unfold shortly after deployment from the rocket, a few hours after launch. With those legs extended, the spacecraft stands about 7.5 feet tall, about 8.5 feet wide. The spacecraft was built using commercially available spacecraft components, and ispace has secured more than $230 million in funding through equity financing and bank loans to help fund their lunar exploration program. Most of that has gone toward the Hakuto-R development, although ispace has not divulged or disclosed the exact cost of this mission alone in a standalone context. So we don't know the mission cost for this particular spacecraft, but we know it fits within that $237 million funding envelope. This, again, if it lands on the moon successfully in late April, will become the first commercial lander to make a controlled touchdown on the lunar surface. The payloads on this lander include a small robotic rover developed by the United Arab Emirates. It also carries a Japanese Space Agency robot that will actually be able to wheel across the lunar surface as well. That small robot from JAXA is only about the size of a baseball, so it's quite small. The UAE lunar rover is about 2 feet by 2 feet in dimension. We recently spoke with Takeshi Hakamada, the founder and CEO of ispace. He talked a little bit about the company's history and talked about the mission goals for Hakuto-R Mission 1. Let's roll that video now. Okay, I'm with Takeshi Hakamada, the founder and CEO of ispace, who's launching their first lunar mission on a Falcon 9 rocket. Takeshi, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me today.
Can you, first of all, tell us a little bit about your company, ispace, and its history and how this mission fits into your company's goals?
Well, we are the company based in Tokyo, Japan, and then also have the office in Denver in US, and then also the Luxembourg in Europe. And then we have a very international operation and business globally. And then I started this company back in 2010. The first objective was to compete for the Google Lunar X Prize. And then we started working together with European team called White Rabbit Space at this moment. However, White Rabbit Space unfortunately stopped their activity due to the financial difficulties. And then we took over the team, right? And then we created Hakuto team for the Lunar X Prize and also ispace in Japan. And then since then, our challenge was for the Lunar X Prize. However, in 2018, Lunar X Prize ended without no winner. And then our launch with Indian rocket and Indian team also canceled. So we are forced to end our first mission as well. However, just before this event, we raised about $100 million to start develop lunar landers and then to create our own transportation business to the lunar surface. And then since then, our mission shifted from only the Lunar X Prize to more broad business, transportation business. And then now we are aiming to launch our first mission in November 13th. This is going to be the first private lunar mission aiming to land on the moon. And then, and then we're going to bring many of the payload from the government side and also the private sectors too. And then this is going to be opening door for the future commercial cislunar industries.
Can you talk about the importance of a mission like this? Because we've heard a lot from NASA, especially talking about opening up a cislunar economy. And this is a fully commercial mission. There's no NASA payload on board that I'm aware of on the lander itself. Can you talk about what this demonstrates? Just getting to this point, being able to develop a flight-ready commercial moon lander.
Well, so our mission is privately funded, and however, we have some relationship with government, like our payload, UAE space agencies, MBRC, and then we also have the JAXA's payload as well. However, most of even these payload, this is commercial contract, not the R&D funding from the government. So totally different from the past, how can I say, engagement with the government. And then, and then also we have the contract with NASA for our first mission as well. This is not payload, but this is also historically important contract because this is going to be the world first commercial transaction of the lunar resources on the lunar surface. This is going to be the transfer of the ownership of the space resources on the surface. That is very important to support, to make sure the future presence of the astronaut or the humans in the long run as a goal of the Artemis program.
You founded this company a decade ago, more than a decade ago. You're on the cusp, on the verge of your first launch. Before I let you go, I just wanted to ask you about your thoughts and feelings and confidence levels going into this mission.
Yeah, I started 12 years ago, and it takes longer than I thought to reach, achieve, come to the mission, actual launch. But this is a necessary step to achieve something. And then we successfully transformed from just a rover development to the lander development. And then having the variety of the support from around us, we could reach to this level. So I really appreciate the people who has been supporting me and then ispace. And then, this is very international mission. So I really, proud of this mission. And then, space is required international cooperations. And then we can become the, bridge between the United States and then out of the United States nations, and also the interface with the industries.
That was my interview with Takeshi Hakamada a few days ago, leading up to the first launch attempt, actually, for this mission with Hakuto-R. That launch attempt was scheduled for November the 30th. As he mentioned in the interview, however, SpaceX called off that launch attempt for additional checks of the rocket. They ultimately rolled the rocket back into the hangar out at Pad 40 for some troubleshooting of an unspecified problem with the Falcon 9 rocket. That issue, whatever it was, now appears to be resolved. SpaceX hasn't told us what that issue was, but they're back on the pad this morning for another countdown, with launch targeted less than 1 hour from now, 59 minutes to be exact, for a liftoff at precisely 2:38 and 13 seconds. 2:38:13 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. That is 7:38:13 a.m. UTC. T-minus 56 minutes, 42 seconds, and counting, about 21 minutes away from the start of propellant loading on the Falcon 9 rocket for this morning's launch at 2:38 a.m. Eastern Time. We talked about the main payload on this mission, which is Hakuto-R, the commercial lunar lander developed by the Japanese company ispace. There is one rideshare or secondary payload hitchhiking to the moon on this rocket. That's called Lunar Flashlight. It's a CubeSat that was developed in partnership by NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the Goddard Space Flight Center, the Marshall Space Flight Center, and Georgia Tech. This CubeSat has a payload that consists of lasers and a spectrometer that will fire these laser beams toward the moon's surface from very low altitude, sometimes as low as about 10 to 12 miles above the surface of the moon. And the returns from those laser beams reflected back to the spacecraft will tell scientists about the potential presence of water ice in hidden cold pockets and dark regions of craters on crater floors near the moon's north and south poles. Scientists know that there is water ice embedded in those regions near the poles, but some of those areas are very difficult to see with instruments that rely on reflected sunlight. Those are very dark regions that don't receive any sunlight in the lunar cycle as it orbits the Earth and revolves on its axis. This is a 6U CubeSat, meaning it's about a 6-unit CubeSat, about the size of a briefcase, with a total mass of 31 pounds or 14 kilograms. Like Hakuto-R, it will take a long duration coast to get to the moon of about 3 to 4 months before entering what's known as a near rectilinear halo orbit. This is an oval-shaped or elliptical orbit around the moon that will stretch from a low point or closest approach to the moon of about 10 to 12 miles, and then at its high point it'll be thousands of miles from the moon's surface. This CubeSat, called Lunar Flashlight, was originally booked and slated to fly on NASA's Space Launch System on the Artemis 1 mission. However, the spacecraft ran into some delays, particularly associated with its propulsion system, that caused it to miss a deadline back in mid-2021 for integration on the Space Launch System for the launch on Artemis 1. This is one of 3 different CubeSat missions that missed that deadline. There were 10 CubeSats that ultimately launched on Artemis 1 out of the 13 that were originally scheduled to fly on the mission. But Lunar Flashlight overcame its technical issues and is actually launching just a few weeks after Artemis when it found an alternate ride on this commercial launch with SpaceX, and will get to the moon in early 2023. We spoke with Barbara Cohen, who's the principal investigator or chief scientist on the Lunar Flashlight mission last week. She's based at Goddard Space Flight Center, and let's roll that video now. Barbara Cohen, the principal investigator for NASA's Lunar Flashlight mission, is joining us now. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Can you talk a little bit about the science goals for this mission? It seems like a pretty lofty ambitions for such a small spacecraft. What are you looking for with Lunar Flashlight?
It is ambitious for a tiny spacecraft. What we are doing is we are using 4 infrared lasers in different infrared wavelengths to search for definitive markers of water ice. So we use the laser to shine onto the surface of the moon. At certain wavelengths, ice will absorb those wavelengths, but rock or regolith will reflect them. So when we shine the lasers down, we look for the return, and the strength of the return tells us whether it's rock or ice, or how much ice was there to absorb or reflect the light back to us. It's a really interesting technique that lets us look into places that sunlight doesn't naturally shine. So when we think about reflectance spectroscopy, we usually think about the sun as a source. So the sun will shine onto the surface. We can see it with our eyes, you can see it with cameras, you can see it with spectroscopy, you can see it with all sorts of different techniques. But if you don't have the sun shining, like in permanently shadowed craters, you have to bring your own illumination, and that's what Lunar Flashlight's doing. So there are lots of places at both poles of the moon where we think there's subsurface ice based on radar and neutron spectroscopy. We also have a lot of tantalizing hints from different kinds of surface measurements that there may be surface water ice as well. All of them are hints. I think scientifically they're pretty compelling, but they're not definitive, and Lunar Flashlight will make that definitive measurement.
What do we know about the quantity of water ice in the poles right now from the previous missions to the moon, and Lunar Flashlight's using this new technique. What will that potentially unveil that wasn't feasible to see with solar reflectance, for example?
Well, when we think about water on the moon, I want us to start thinking more about water cycles like we would think about on the Earth or even on Mars, right? There's no one place or one kind of water on the moon. It's part of a bigger cycle of things being input to the moon, outgassing from the moon, interaction of the solar wind with lunar regolith, ancient comets and meteorites impacting and getting buried. It's a very rich cycle of things that could bring water to the moon and that can lose water from the moon. So the story of water on the moon is complex, and lots of different techniques have looked at different parts of it. And what we're trying to do now is really piece together how different sources got there, how fast they're lost, how long they persist. And that story is whether they can be used as a resource. So scientifically, it's really interesting to understand how water gets made, how it's brought there, how it's lost. That's super great. And I'm a scientist and I'm very interested in that. But if you want to use those as resources, you really need to know how long they persist and whether they're going to be renewable. So that is what we're trying to get at with the surface water ice. The deep water ice is not something that Lunar Flashlight can look at because we are using reflectance spectroscopy, as I said, with a small wavelength, so we bounce off the very surface. To get to deeper under the surface, we use things like radar that has a longer penetration depth. And those stores, the deep water stores and the surface water stores, we don't know whether they're connected to each other. We don't know if they're related to each other. So that's part of our mission too, is to not only detect where that water ice frost is, but understand how it's related to different geologic processes like impact craters, slopes, loose regolith, new regolith, boulders, things like that, so that we can understand how surface water ice manifests itself everywhere, even in places where maybe we don't measure.
With the lasers, what kind of spatial resolution can you get to kind of locate where these water ice deposits may be?
Our lasers are pretty small. At about 20 kilometers altitude, we have a footprint of about 30 meters across. The lower we get, obviously, the smaller that gets, the higher up we are, the more diffuse it is. If we're even higher up, that diffuse light, we have so few photons that reflect back to us that we can't make a good measurement. So we do have to get pretty low to the surface. But then for every time we shine a laser and get a return, the return is going to be very weak. We know that. That's part of the design, and it's also part of being a very small spacecraft, is we didn't have a lot of power to pump into these lasers. So each one of those returns will be weak, and what we're going to need to do is add them along track. So as we go and as we're shining the laser down and getting the return, every measurement that we get, we're going to add when we get on the ground. So we'll add them mathematically, we'll make that signal to noise increase, and we'll be able to see the water ice signature. So the ultimate footprint is going to depend a little bit on how strong that signal is, how close we are, but our expectation is that we're going to get kind of thin noodles back that are going to be about 30 meters wide by something like 1 to 2 kilometers along track.
So this mission is going to a near rectilinear halo orbit around the moon, if I understand correctly, and it's taking kind of a long, in yeah, a NRHO, let's call it that, and it's taking kind of a long route to get there. Can you walk me through the mechanics of where the Falcon 9 rocket drops the spacecraft off? Is it in Earth orbit, or what altitude? And then kind of the maneuvers and orbital mechanics to get into that NRHO.
Sure. So the Falcon 9 lifts us out of Earth orbit. So first stage gets us pretty high. The second stage will get us out of the Earth's gravitational pull. The primary on this Falcon 9 is the Hakuto R lander from JAXA. That's a polar lander, so it needs to get out of Earth's gravity as well. So this rocket will get us all out of Earth's gravity. And then Lunar Flashlight has its own onboard propulsion system. We're using green propellant that has been previously tried out in Earth orbit in the Green Propellant Infusion mission, or GPIM. We're going to be the first ones trying it in an interplanetary orbit or for in-space propulsion. And we have that because we need to get into a polar orbit. So When we launch from the Earth, we're in the plane of the equator. We're in an equatorial plane, right? So if we just go to the moon, like Orion just did, it's going in an equatorial orbit. We want to change our orbit to be polar so that we can skim real low over the South Pole. So in order to do that, we have to go find one of the low energy capture orbits. It takes us a little while to get there using our very, very, very small propulsion system. It's literally only this big, this much fuel for the whole spacecraft. So it takes us a little while to do that. It takes us about 4 months to get captured into a polar lunar orbit so that we can make those close passes over the South Pole.
And I know Lunar Flashlight was originally going to be launched on Artemis 1, but the mission wasn't quite ready to be integrated with the rocket when that cutoff was, I think, last year. Can you talk about why you missed that deadline and the effort to find a new ride?
Sure. Well, Lunar Flashlight, we wrote that proposal in 2013, and that was long before many of these missions had ever even thought about finding water ice. So we had this kind of vision for what we wanted the mission to do a long time ago, and it went through a lot of incarnations as we tried to find our way. So our original idea was that we would have um, a solar sail that was our propulsion system and an independent light source. Then we had our solar sail become our light source as well. We were going to try to angle our solar sail to provide light from the sun to reflect it. It turns out that the solar sail um, wasn't good for us to try to maneuver, right? So we had to get into this orbit as we just talked about, and the solar sail it was making it difficult to get into the orbit we needed. So we had to ditch the solar sail and go to chemical propulsion. That meant we lost our illumination source. Then we moved to these lasers. So it was a long development history. And as we went to this chemical propulsion source, and as I said, it's a new propellant, there's a lot of testing and prototyping that had to happen. And so uh, that effort took a long time. And so that plus the pandemic, of course, pushed us beyond the limit for integration to Artemis. But as you said, it turns out that now we have arrived. It's right after Artemis. So we're just about 2 weeks later than we would have been otherwise. And in fact, we're in a little bit of a better situation because we are fully charged. We didn't have to sit on the pad for a year. And the SpaceX rocket that's taking us and Hokuto has a more direct trajectory than Artemis did. So it actually improves our trajectory a little bit. And the silver lining from the Artemis CubeSat experience is that we have some of their stories about how they were deployed. We're using the same deployer, what they went through to detumble and acquire a signal, and how many of the common components that are in Lunar Flashlight and the Artemis CubeSats are performing. And so we get kind of the benefit of their experience as well.
How close will Lunar Flashlight be over the South Pole when it's making these measurements?
So we are hoping to get within 20 kilometers of the lunar reference surface. There is topography at the South Pole, so we'll be, the distance between the spacecraft and the ground will vary a little bit, but we want to get below 20 kilometers from the reference surface. And again, that's just because our lasers are not super strong. When you think about laser altimetry, for example, around the moon or around Mars, those instruments have a lot of power at a very short laser pulse. Ours is not a short laser pulse, it's a little bit longer and it has less power, so we need to get a little bit lower. So it's a pretty sporty orbit to get within 20 kilometers of the South Pole. We're only there for about 2 or 3 minutes, and then we're out again in that long looping NRHO orbit that takes about 6.5 days in total. So we get about 3 minutes of close pass for 6.5 days of orbit.
That was Barbara Cohen, the principal investigator for NASA's Lunar Flashlight mission. She's from NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. Lunar Flashlight is a secondary or rideshare payload on the Falcon 9 rocket that you see out on Pad 40 right now, a little more than 42 minutes from liftoff. Again, the primary payload on this mission is Hokuto-R, which is the privately developed lunar lander owned by Tokyo-based ispace. It's a Japanese company that was founded back in 2010 to pursue the Google Lunar X Prize. They pivoted to a new objective of developing a lunar transportation services type business after the Google Lunar X Prize ended a few years ago without a winner. And this is iSpace's first mission, mission number 1, on the pad this morning at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, awaiting liftoff on SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. The next major milestone in this morning's countdown will be coming up in a few minutes. We should hear the outcome of the go or no-go poll of SpaceX's launch team to confirm their readiness to proceed into propellant loading this morning. That propellant loading of kerosene fuel and liquid oxygen, the oxidizer, is due to get underway at T-minus 35 minutes.
Touchdown countdown. Polling is complete. The integrated team has polled go for propellant load and launch. Stand by for abort instructions. For non-urgent, no-go conditions, brief the CE and LD. They will approve aborting the countdown. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operators shall call hold on the countdown net. Launch control will abort the launch auto sequence and proceed into launch abort. At T-minus 10 seconds, launch control will be hands-off and relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count.
You're hearing now the voice of the launch director, the SpaceX launch director, down at the Launch Control Center, just outside the south gate to Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. And he's saying that the team polled go for propellant loading and launch. Everything looking good right now for liftoff a little more than 37 minutes from now at 2:38 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 7:38 a.m. UTC. Again, you're looking at a live shot of SpaceX's 229-foot tall, 70-meter tall Falcon 9 on pad 40, awaiting liftoff with
Falcon 9 tanks are venting for the start of prop load.
Awaiting liftoff with the Hokuto R lander, a moon lander developed by the Japanese company ispace, as well as NASA's Lunar Flashlight mission, a CubeSat, that will search for signs of water ice at the moon's poles. Less than 2 minutes now until the start of propellant loading.
Launch auto sequence has started.
2 minutes 35 minutes and counting. We just heard the call that launch auto sequence has started. So the process of loading about 1 million pounds of RP1, which is rocket propellant 1, that's a highly refined kerosene fuel, as well as liquid oxygen, is getting underway out at pad 40. The liquid oxygen is chilled to several hundred degrees below zero. The Falcon 9 uses what's known as densified or super chilled propellants, with both the kerosene and liquid oxygen chilled to close to their freezing points, closer to their freezing points than typically would be used on other launch vehicles. This essentially allows the Falcon 9 to fit more propellant molecules into its tanks. It gives the Falcon 9 a performance boost to lift heavier payloads into orbit. It also ensures that the Falcon 9 first stage has enough reserve propellant to be able to perform its return to launch site landing maneuvers for recovery and reuse. Now 33 minutes from the scheduled launch of Hakuto-R, iSpace's first commercial lunar lander mission. This mission carries several small payloads on the Hakuto-R lander that will be attempting to land on the surface of the moon in late April. One of those, and the largest actually, is the Rashid rover developed by the Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center in Dubai. It's from the United Arab Emirates. The Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center, or MBRSC, is the same facility, same space center that developed and worked on the Hope Mars orbiter that launched back in 2020 and entered orbit around Mars in 2021. So they do have some experience with deep space missions, but this is their first lunar mission. The Rashid rover will be deployed from the Hakuto-R lander after it touches down on the lunar surface, and Hakuto-R and the rover will operate for about 10 to 14 days on the lunar surface, assuming the landing is successful. During the lunar daylight period, The lander and the rover are not designed to survive the lunar night. This rover, as you can see here in comparison to some of the project members from MBRSC, is about 22 pounds or 10 kilograms in mass. It measures about 21 by 21 inches. That's 53 by 53 centimeters, so it's quite a small rover. It carries several payloads, including some optical cameras that were provided by the French space agency CNES. There's also a microscopic imager that will take close-up pictures of lunar rocks and regolith, and Langmuir probes that will measure the plasma environment on the lunar surface. The maximum speed for this machine rover on the moon surface is about 4 inches or 10 centimeters per second, and will actually be relaying its data and imagery back to Earth via a wireless connection to the Hakuto-R lander, which will then relay the data back to Earth to ground teams in Dubai. We're now going to go to another segment of our interview with Takeshi Hakamada, the founder and CEO of ispace, which developed the Hakuto-R lunar lander on this morning's Falcon 9 launch.
Can you talk a little bit about the lander itself? How big is it? How heavy is it at launch when it's fully fueled? Talk a little bit about the design and architecture of this spacecraft.
Our lander is very small, micro lander, compared to the large-scale landers like Apollo landers. And then our launch mass is about 1,000 kilograms, including propellant. And then so-called dry mass, hardware mass, is about 350 kilograms. So the about 700 kilograms is propellant. And then this lander can support 30 kilograms of payload to the lunar surface as a design. And for our first mission, we're going to bring about 11 kilograms of payload to the lunar surface, including MBRC's lunar rovers, also the JAXA's robot, and then other payload as well. And then the size of the lander, let's say the height of the lander is about 2 meters, and then the width is about 1 meter, 1.5 meters. So it's a very tiny, small lander compared to the others.
When you built this lander, can you talk about the division of work? What activity and what development took place in Japan? What took place in Europe to prepare this mission for launch?
Well, as a first mission, my strategy is to accelerate the speed to go to the market. And then in order to that, we recognized become the system integrator is key to accelerate the speed of development. If we develop each of the components, it takes time. And then especially lunar lander, it's not new stuff. We know that Apollo already landed the moon several times, even the other robotics mission in the past. So there's technology, and then important point is how to formulate, integrate such a technology into one system with enough funding. So from the beginning, we identified already proven technologies, component from all the world. And then we have been working with Ariane Group for the propulsion system. We procure several propulsion components already used for the satellite, so on. And most of the risk, technology risk is already de-risked and then mitigated. And then also for the, at the time of the landing, in addition to the propulsion system, also the control system is important. So we have been working with Draper Laboratory in US. They provide guidance navigation control software for us, especially for the landing phase. The Draper Laboratory already experienced such a development at the time of the Apollo program. And then they leverage such experience, and then having the state-of-art experience and the technologies, especially software capability, where they provide very credible GNC software for us.
That was Takeshi Hakamada, the founder and CEO of ispace, talking a little bit about the lander itself, the design, as well as some of the team members that he has brought together in pursuit of this mission, such as Ariane Group in Germany, which provided the propulsion system for the lander. It also oversaw the integration of the spacecraft in Germany before shipment to here at Cape Canaveral for launch preparations. This is a map here of the potential landing sites for Hokuto R. The primary landing site is in the northern part of the nearest side of the moon in the northern hemisphere. This landing site is called Mare Frigoris, and it will be targeting a landing in Atlas Crater, within that region on the northern hemisphere of the nearest side of the moon. Again, that landing is scheduled for late April, assuming the launch occurs before mid-December during this particular launch period. The launch was originally scheduled for back on November 30th, but SpaceX delayed the launch until tonight, till this morning, to resolve a problem with the Falcon 9 launch vehicle. Here's a look at the countdown timeline this morning. We've already passed a few of these milestones, such as the start of propellant loading, which was confirmed at T-minus 35 minutes. So that propellant loading is now underway. 3 of the 4 propellant tanks are now being filled with their liquid propellants. First stage is getting its fuel and oxidizer. The second stage is getting its kerosene fuel, and we'll begin loading liquid oxygen on the upper stage at T-minus 16 minutes. At T-minus 7 minutes, the Falcon 9's 9 Merlin 1D engines on the first stage will be chilled and thermally conditioned for launch. That involves flowing a little bit of the super cold liquid oxygen into the engine compartment to thermally condition those components for ignition. At T-minus 5.5 minutes, the first stage will be full of kerosene. Second stage will be fully loaded at T-minus 20 minutes. So at T-minus 5.5 minutes, the rocket will be fully fueled. Oxidizer loading will continue until about T-minus 2 minutes. At that point, the liquid oxygen loading will be terminated. And at T-minus 60 seconds, control of the countdown will switch from a ground computer to the Falcon 9's onboard computer. That will oversee the final minute of the countdown, including pressurization of the Falcon 9's propellant tanks and the command to start the 9 Merlin 1D engines at T-minus 3 seconds. And those computers on the Falcon 9 will oversee a health check of the engines as they start up and throttle up to full power. If everything looks good, the Falcon 9 will give the command itself for the clamps at the bottom of the rocket on the launch pad to open, allowing the Falcon 9 to begin its climb off of pad 40. Again, the launch is scheduled for 2:38 a.m. Eastern Time, 7:38 a.m. UTC.
Stage 1, Pogo. Stage 2, RP1 load is complete.
Now seeing the big vent from the strongback at pad 40. This is a vent of gaseous oxygen from the strongback right after the confirmation of the conclusion of kerosene loading on the second stage. This vent is associated with the thermal conditioning or chill down of the liquid oxygen loading lines that run up the strongback into the upper stage ahead of loading of that tank coming up at T-minus 16 minutes. Also, a few minutes ago, we heard confirmation that the ispace Hakutoar spacecraft is on internal power for launch, so it's been transitioned off its ground power supply. It's now operating off its onboard batteries. Those batteries will begin to be recharged after the spacecraft arrives in space and is separated from the Falcon 9 about 47 minutes after liftoff. The spacecraft doesn't have any deployable solar panels. Its solar panels for generation of electricity are mounted on the body of the spacecraft. That's a simplification of the design to reduce the number of deployable events. Those are things that could go wrong in orbit. And the company elected to have body-mounted solar panels. These are fixed arrays on the outer surface of the spacecraft for power generation.
Stage 2, LOX load has started.
There's confirmation from SpaceX Launch Control that the liquid oxygen loading on the second stage is now underway. T-minus 15 minutes and counting, just past the T-minus 15-minute mark. So at this point, liquid oxygen, again, is now flowing into the upper stage. Kerosene and liquid oxygen continue to flow into the first stage of the Falcon 9, and the second stage kerosene tank is now fully loaded. We're now going to show a video from the integration of the ispace Akuto R lunar lander. This shows the integration of the landing legs in a clean room ahead of the launch. Let's roll that video now. This shows the spacecraft. Again, it's about 7.5 feet tall, 8.5 feet wide with its landing legs deployed. This integration activity occurred in advance of the shipment, before the shipment of the spacecraft to the Cape Canaveral spaceport for launch preparations. You get a good sense of the scale of the spacecraft here with some of the technicians and engineers working on it. I talked about those body-mounted solar arrays. You can see those there. And this is the attachment of one of the 4 landing legs. These landing legs are folded up against the spacecraft body for the launch to fit inside the payload fairing of the Falcon 9. After the spacecraft deploys from the rocket, one of its first tasks in the hours after deployment, soon after deployment, will be the extension of these landing legs. That's the only major deployable apparatus or structure on the spacecraft. The spacecraft, fully fueled with its hydrazine fuel and oxidizer, is about 1 metric ton or 2,200 pounds in mass. "13 minutes, 10 seconds remaining until launch." You're looking again live at pad 40. You can see the frost line on the first stage liquid oxygen tank rising as that tank is filled up. That liquid oxygen is chilled to several hundred degrees below zero and creates some ice and frost that turns that charcoal color from the soot and markings, scorch markings from the booster's previous flights to space, brighter white, so you can really track the progress of the propellant loading as that white frost line creeps up the height of that liquid oxygen tank. Below the liquid oxygen tank is the kerosene tank at the very bottom of the first stage booster. Below that, of course, is the engine compartment with the 9 Merlin 1D engines. Now approaching T-minus 12 minutes. The first stage booster on this Falcon 9 rocket is booster 1073, making its 5th flight to space. Here's a look at its 4 previous missions. It debuted back in May on the Starlink 4-15 mission. It launched again in June with the SES-22 commercial communications satellite. Its 3rd flight was back in August on another Starlink mission, Starlink 4-25. And most recently, another Starlink mission, September the 24th, Starlink 4-35. That was the 4th flight for booster 1073. And flight number 5 for this booster is scheduled for this morning, now 11 minutes, 20 seconds away. After liftoff, the Falcon 9's rocket will head just north of due east from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station out over the Atlantic Ocean. This red line shows the approximate ground track for the Falcon 9 as it makes its way into space. We've labeled here the location of Space Launch Complex 40 here at Cape Canaveral. So again, this is a easterly launch heading out over the Atlantic Ocean downrange from Cape Canaveral. The first stage booster will be returning to landing at Landing Zone 2 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station about 8 minutes after launch. Here's a look at the launch timeline. So here's what you can expect to see during this morning's flight sequence. After liftoff, the Falcon 9 will be surpassing the speed of sound in about less than a minute, actually. At about T plus 1 minute 12 seconds, it'll pass max Q, or maximum aerodynamic pressure. And the first stage will cut off its engines at 2 minutes and 13 seconds. A few seconds later, the stages will separate, and the first stage will relight its engines, 3 of its engines, for what's known as a boost back burn, to essentially zero out its downrange velocity and reverse course to head back for landing here at the Cape. The second stage will light its single Merlin vacuum engine for a burn to insert the Hakuto-R lunar lander into a low-altitude parking orbit. The payload fairing on the upper stage will be jettisoned at about 3 minutes into the flight. While the second stage is doing its job to propel the ispace Hakuto-R lander into orbit, the first stage will do an entry burn using 3 of its engines to help slow down for the reentry back into the atmosphere, and then it will light a single center engine at T plus 7 minutes 44 seconds for a final braking burn to settle onto landing zone 2 down at the Cape at T plus 8 minutes 16 seconds. At about the same time, the second stage will complete its orbit insertion burn and cut off its engine and coast halfway around the world, nearly halfway around the world, until T plus 40 minutes, when it will relight its upper stage engine for about a 56-second burn. That'll be a burn to propel Hakuto-R and Lunar Flashlight onto a trajectory that will take them ultimately to the moon. Hakuto-R will separate from the rocket first at T plus 46 minutes 59 seconds. They'll be followed about 6 minutes later by Lunar Flashlight separation. If you're just joining us, we're about 8 minutes 15 seconds from the scheduled launch of a Falcon 9 rocket. Please hit the like button here on our YouTube stream. That helps us gain a larger audience for our live launch coverage. We want to bring this to as many interested people as possible. One way you can help us do that is just by hitting the thumbs up or like button here on YouTube. Also, if you want to support our coverage, you can become a member of our YouTube channel. You can join our channel by clicking the join button and gain access to exclusive members-only video features from our coverage of space program activities here at the Cape and around the world. And you'll be helping us continue, maintain, and expand our coverage of the ever-growing rate of launch activity around the world. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and get alerts every time we're going live with launch coverage. The next major milestone at T-minus 7 minutes will be the start of the chill down of the Merlin 1D engines. This involves flowing small amounts of liquid oxygen into the engine compartment to condition some of those components for the more rapid flow of supercold propellant when those engines start up at T-minus 3 seconds.
Engine chill has started.
There's the call from SpaceX Launch Control that engine chill has started, so that thermal conditioning got underway right on time at T-minus 7 minutes.
Stage 1 RP1 load is complete.
SpaceX has confirmed that the first stage is now fully loaded with rocket-grade kerosene, or RP1. So about 46,000 gallons of kerosene has now been loaded into the launch vehicle. Next milestone will be coming at about T-minus 4.5 minutes with the beginning of the retraction of the strongback.
Falcon 9 tanks are pressurizing for strongback retract.
Strongback retract has started.
Now approaching T-minus 3.5 minutes, we're seeing the strongback begin its retraction from the Falcon 9. It's moving back to an angle of about 1.5 degrees. The strongback will retract fully, or actually to an angle of about 45 degrees at liftoff. The next big milestone in the countdown will be the termination or the ending of liquid oxygen loading on the Falcon 9. That's coming at about T-minus 2 minutes.
Stage 1 LOX load complete. Stage 1 POGO.
Now inside of 2 minutes and counting, everything continuing to look good for launch at 2:38 a.m. Eastern Time. Liftoff is targeted for exactly 2:38 and 13 seconds Eastern Time, 7:38:13 UTC.
Stage 2 LOX load is complete.
And there's the call from SpaceX Launch Control that the Stage 2 liquid oxygen loading has been completed. So SpaceX has a fully loaded Falcon 9 on pad 40. It weighs about 1.2 million pounds, 1 million pounds of that
Ground gas
consisting
closeouts
of
has started.
propellant.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
Falcon 9 now in startup. That's the call that marks the transition of control of the countdown to the Falcon 9's onboard computer.
Falcon 9, ispace. Go for launch.
Launch director confirms he's go for launch. T-minus 30 seconds. The engine ignition command will be issued at T-minus 3 seconds. You may see a brief green flash. That's the igniter fluid, followed by the orange glow from the 9 Merlin engines. T-minus 10 seconds.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3.
We have engine ignition and liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket with iSpace's Hakuto-R lunar lander.
Vehicles pitching downrange.
Stage 1 propulsion is nominal.
T-plus 20 seconds. Good calls from SpaceX. Good propulsion reported from a launch control. T-plus 25 seconds. We'll listen to the roar of the engines now. Now approaching T-plus 90 seconds. Hope you enjoyed the sound from the 9 Merlin engines. Falcon 9 heading east out over the Atlantic Ocean now. About 30 seconds remaining in the first stage burn. That'll be followed by stage separation. And then we'll see quite a spectacle in the sky with the ignition of the second stage engine and the restart of the first stage engines for a boost back burn to begin the return to Cape Canaveral for landing. Five seconds from main engine cutoff. There's MECO, main engine cutoff.
Stage separation confirmed.
Staging has been confirmed. And we see ignition of the MVAC engine. The Merlin vacuum engine on stage 2 has ignited, and we see ignition now of the 3 engines. 3 of the 9 engines on the first stage have ignited for the boost back burn.
Fairing separation confirmed.
SpaceX confirms a separation of the payload fairing. That's the clamshell-like nose cone that encapsulated the ispace Hakuto-R lunar lander during the initial phases of the launch, the climb through the atmosphere. And we see cutoff now of the first stage engines. Boost back burn has been completed. We're now going to switch over to SpaceX's feed for a moment, showing 2 onboard camera views. One on the left-hand side of the screen here shows the first stage, and now we're seeing a full-frame view of the Merlin vacuum engine. On the second stage, this is the engine that's firing to propel Hakuto-R into a low-altitude parking orbit. This engine will be burning until about T+8 minutes. Velocity on the upper stage passing 7,800 kilometers per hour at an altitude of 140 kilometers. 4 minutes, 20 seconds into the flight. The SpaceX views from onboard cameras come with about 10 to 15 seconds of delay.
Vehicles on nominal trajectory.
We're hearing good calls from SpaceX engineers monitoring telemetry from the Falcon 9. Everything looking good. About 3 minutes until landing of the first stage. A little less than 3 minutes until the cutoff of the second stage engine. Those events will be occurring at about the same time. And we're about a minute away from the entry burn of the first stage. So we'll see 3 of the first stage engines relight once again for a braking maneuver, a retro burn to slow the rocket down as it falls back into the atmosphere. Meanwhile, we're still showing live views from SpaceX's second stage, showing the engine bell glowing red hot, that engine producing more than 200,000 pounds of thrust, burning kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants. We've passed the T+6 minute mark, coming up on the entry burn in less than 30 seconds. And the entry burn has gotten underway. 3 engines have lit to slow the rocket down for entry. Here's the view from our camera showing the entry burn.
Stage 1 entry burn shut down.
Stage 1 FTS is saved.
Entry burn has been completed. The next thing we'll see from the booster is the relight of the center engine for a final braking maneuver, a final landing burn before it touches down on landing zone 2.
Start of terminal guidance.
Great view here from one of the onboard cameras. On the left, you see the lights of the Space Coast growing larger in the field of view as the rocket makes its descent. It is just passed below the speed of sound. And there's the landing burn. Landing burn underway.
Stage 1 landing burn.
MVAC shut down.
Stage 2 FTS is saved. Nominal orbit insertion.
It's now passed below the tree line here. We're switching over to SpaceX, showing that landing burn underway, standing by for touchdown on landing zone 2.
Stage 1 landing confirmed.
We've heard the call from SpaceX Launch Control that the landing has been confirmed. This video, we just heard the dual sonic booms. You may have heard that. Very loud, very pronounced signature from those sonic booms here at the Cape. And we see now this view from SpaceX showing the rocket on landing zone 2, a successful landing back at the Cape. And now a view from the upper stage showing the Hakuto-R lander and the second stage in parking orbit. So the rocket will be now coasting until T plus 40 minutes. So about a 31-minute coast until the second stage relights. That relight will propel the Hakuto R spacecraft and Lunar Flashlight spacecraft on a trajectory with enough speed to escape the gravitational bonds of Earth to head out toward the moon. Now 14 minutes, 25 seconds into the Falcon 9's launch with Hakuto-R, the commercial lunar lander developed by ispace. We're now going to show the third and final segment of our interview, our pre-launch chat with Takeshi Hakamada, the founder and CEO of ispace, to talk a little bit more about this mission.
And can you know, once the launch is complete, once the spacecraft is deployed from the Falcon 9 rocket, it's launched into this really, really high orbit, as I understand, like beyond the distance of the moon. Can you talk about the trajectory it takes for the lander to fly from that orbit to reach the moon? And
Sure.
when will the landing actually occur?
Yeah, so we're gonna launch our lander by SpaceX Falcon 9, and then Falcon 9 will bring us to the higher orbit than the GTO, and then they separate our lander. The orbit, it's unique orbit. It's easy to go to the Mars, to the moon, and then. Our lander has propulsion system, so after the separation, we're gonna thrust our the thruster and then enter the low energy orbit, and then this orbit will take about 5 months to land on the moon, and then we called it low energy orbit because we can reduce the propellant consumption using this orbit, having the assist from the gravity from the Earth, from the sun, and then in order to reduce the launch mass and then reduce launch cost, we selected this orbit. But this orbit is similar. There's several recent missions to select a similar trajectory, like a capstone mission by NASA or the Korean's lunar orbiters as well. So we don't think there's a lot of risk on this orbit, or rather than that, we have more advantage reducing the propellant. Selecting this orbit.
Just to clarify, you said the Falcon 9 deploys your spacecraft into an orbit that's above geostationary transfer orbit,
right.
But your lander, the spacecraft itself, does the final maneuver to go into this long phasing orbit, 1.5 million kilometers.
Yeah.
Okay. And the landing would occur in the spring time frame if you launch?
Yeah, it takes 5 months after the launch. So we target land on the moon around the end of April.
You mentioned there have been moon landers before, but nothing quite like your spacecraft, like a fully privately developed mission. What do you think the odds are, chances are for success on this mission, and how do you define success? Is it delivery of the payloads on the surface, or if you don't do that but learn a lot of lessons, can you still call it a success?
Yeah, well, we don't calculate the percentage of the landing. However, we define 10 milestones during the course of our mission. And then each of the milestones is very important to achieve each of the phases to accomplish our landing. And then we believe that from each of the milestones, we can learn the lesson learned. And then important point is we're going to create the mechanism to feedback what we learned through the first mission to the second mission, the third mission. So in order to do this subsequent way, we've already initiated mission 2, mission 3 development, and then are ready to acquire lesson learned from our first mission to improve and then mature our technology and then our business.
When is mission 2 and mission 3, when are those scheduled to launch?
Well, mission 2 is scheduled to launch 2024, and then third mission are going to be 25.
And will those use a similar spacecraft as you're using for mission 1, or will there be upgrades? Will it be a bigger vehicle?
Well, regarding mission 2, we're going to utilize same lander as mission 1, we called Series 1 lander. Its micro lander can support 30 kilograms of payload to deliver on the lunar surface. And then having such a experience, a lesson learned from the Series 1 lander, we've already started next generation lander development here in the United States. It's called Series 2 lander, which can support up to 500 kilograms of payload capacity to the lunar surface. And then, as I said, our intention strategy is to get, lesson learned from the previous missions, and then improve our technology maturity dramatically having such experience.
That was Takeshi Hakamada, the founder and CEO of ispace. That's the Tokyo-based company that developed and owns the Hakuto R lunar lander spacecraft that we saw launched a little more than 20 minutes ago from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. In 20 minutes, the rocket has crossed the Atlantic Ocean and is now approaching the west coast of Africa. And in another 20 minutes or so, the Falcon 9's second stage engine will relight for a 56-second burn to reach the expected trajectory for payload deployment. That's going to be a trajectory to escape the gravitational bond of Earth, to propel itself out of Earth orbit and eventually reach the moon. This is a low-energy ballistic lunar transfer trajectory. This is a fuel-efficient path toward the moon. If you're familiar with the Apollo missions from the 1960s and 70s, those missions took a few days, usually about 4 days, to fly from the Earth to the moon. And the Artemis 1 mission, currently in space, heading back to Earth for splashdown tomorrow, took about 6 days from launch until arrival at the moon. But Hakuto R, as is the case with many of the new wave of small commercial lunar missions, is taking a more fuel-efficient route. It takes longer, about 4 months in this case, but requires much less propellant consumption and allows developers and engineers to create a spacecraft that is much smaller and can fly on a smaller, less expensive launch vehicle as well. So Hakuto R, as well as NASA's Lunar Flashlight mission, the rideshare on this launch, are taking advantage of that low-energy, fuel-efficient transfer to the moon. Here you're looking at a live shot of Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where the Falcon 9 took off 22 minutes ago. T plus 30 minutes, we're now seeing great views from the Falcon 9's upper stage, showing the Kutuar lunar lander as the rocket and payload soar over Africa. Here's a shot of the upper stage engine, and now a map showing the location of the upper stage over Africa. These views and this map are provided by SpaceX. We've now added a clock on the upper right here of our stream, showing the countdown until the time of the deployment or separation of the Hakutuar lunar lander. Less than 16 minutes away now, and we're about 9 minutes away from the restart of the second stage engine. Passing 32 minutes into the Falcon 9's launch with a Kutuar and Lunar Flashlight. Before the launch, we aired some video showing views inside a clean room where the landing legs were integrated with the Kutuar lunar lander, and also some clips of our pre-launch interview with the ispace founder and CEO Takeshi Hakamada. We're now going to show some animation from ispace showing what the mission profile will be like. This animation was provided by ispace. This is a previous Falcon 9 launch. Of course, this one actually launched this morning at night in darkness, but this is a representative animation showing what will happen with the spacecraft after deploying from the Falcon 9 rocket. It will deploy those landing legs. It'll perform its first main engine burn about a day or two after the launch to begin propelling itself toward the moon on its low-energy transfer trajectory. Here's the view of the propulsion system with a hydrazine-fueled engine and also some auxiliary thrusters. This propulsion system was provided to ispace by Ariane Group, a subcontractor on this mission. Ariane Group developed this propulsion system and integrated it with the spacecraft in Germany. Here's a shot of what we can expect on landing. This is expected in late April, showing the autonomous guidance, navigation, and control system, as well as a terrain camera that will be looking toward the horizon of the moon during the final descent, and the thrusters firing to slow down for landing. Landing is targeted for the nearest side of the moon in a region known as Atlas Crater in the northern hemisphere. After landing, the Hakutuar lander will deploy the Rashid rover developed by the United Arab Emirates. It also carries a transformable mobile robot from the Japanese Space Agency, also called JAXA, that will test mobility on the lunar surface. These are very small payloads. The rover from the UAE is about 2 feet by 2 feet, a half meter by half meter or so in size. The Japanese robot is about the size of a baseball, and the mission is expected to last about 10 to 14 days after landing and will end when the landing site moves into lunar night, and the lander is not designed to survive in darkness without illumination on its solar arrays, so after about 2 weeks, the mission will end. And we're back with a live map of the location of the Falcon 9 rocket, now passing over Africa. It'll soon head out over the Indian Ocean and Madagascar. Coming up in about 5 minutes will be the restart of the second stage engine for a nearly 1 minute long burn that will propel the Hakutuar spacecraft out of its low Earth orbit into a trajectory that will take it out toward the moon. SpaceX's upper stage engine should now be firing to propel the Hakuto lander out of its low-altitude parking orbit out toward the moon. However, we're not getting any updates from SpaceX right now on the status of this burn. This burn may be occurring without ground station coverage. Now 46 minutes into the flight of the Falcon 9 rocket with Japan's Hakuto lander. The second burn by the upper stage engine should now be complete. That burn occurred without ground station coverage. So we should be confirming that through SpaceX momentarily. That'll be followed coming up in less than a minute by separation of the ispace Hakuto spacecraft from the Falcon 9's second stage.
ispace M1 payload deploy confirmed.
And we have confirmation now from SpaceX Launch Control that the Hakuto spacecraft has deployed from the Falcon 9's upper stage. Presumably that second stage burn occurred successfully, and now we're seeing live views from the Falcon 9 showing the Hakuto lander as it flies free of the upper stage over the Indian Ocean. We see the altitude climbing past 1,000 kilometers now, so that's indicative that this burn was completed to propel the Hakuto lander out of its low altitude transfer orbit up to an escape trajectory that carries it farther away from Earth, ultimately toward the moon, for a 4-month low-energy transfer to the moon, culminating with a lunar landing attempt in late April. One of the first tasks for the spacecraft will be to send signals down to the control team in Tokyo that will be monitoring systems on the spacecraft throughout its journey to the moon. The lander will also extend its 4 landing legs shortly after deployment from the rocket, and then the first main engine burn by Hakuto is scheduled about a day or two after launch. One of the next main milestones, and in fact the last major milestone on this mission, will be the deployment of Lunar Flashlight. This is the Jet Propulsion Laboratory-led CubeSat project that will head out toward the moon, enter an orbit around the moon early next year. Use lasers to search for signs of water ice deposits and permanently shadowed craters at the moon's poles. This CubeSat is about the size of a briefcase with a mass of about 14 kilograms or 30 pounds. That deployment is in about 2.5 minutes.
Lunar Flashlight separation confirmed.
And SpaceX has now confirmed the deployment of Lunar Flashlight, the rideshare payload. The rideshare payload developed by NASA in partnership with Georgia Tech, as well as scientists from other institutions around the country, around the United States. So both payloads have deployed the Hakuto-R moonlander from ispace, the privately developed spacecraft on the way to the moon, as well as the Lunar Flashlight mission from NASA, the rideshare CubeSat, on the way to search for signs of water ice at the moon's poles. We're also seeing some early visual indications that appear to show that the landing legs on the Hakuto-R lander have extended as expected. The legs were expected to unfurl moments after spacecraft separation from the rocket, and we did see some visual indication from the Falcon 9's onboard camera that the landing gear looks like it has extended. That's one of the first automated tasks for the spacecraft after it flies off the Falcon 9 rocket. The spacecraft will soon radio its status to ispace Mission Control in Tokyo. Engineers there are gathered at this hour to receive the first signals from the spacecraft through a ground station. Likewise, control teams in the U.S. will be listening for signals from Lunar Flashlight as it beams its status back to Earth as it begins its trip out toward the moon. Here's another shot of Pad 40, where the Falcon 9 lifted off at 2:38 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 7:38 UTC, about 55 minutes ago. As we approach nearly 1 hour since the launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket, we're going to conclude our coverage momentarily. But first, a few updates on some of the comings and goings here at the Space Center. You're looking now live at NASA's Pegasus barge parked just behind me, actually, at the press site at the turn basin here at Kennedy Space Center. The Pegasus barge is used to transport rocket components for the Space Launch System moon rocket. And inside that barge is the engine section for the Space Launch System moon rocket that's slated to fly on the Artemis 3 mission. That's the first Artemis mission that will attempt a landing on the moon. So the engine section is in that barge. It doesn't have the engines installed yet, that will come later. But the engine section has been delivered to Florida from the Michoud Assembly Facility in Louisiana and will be offloaded in a few hours' time and transferred inside the Vehicle Assembly Building, where it will await the arrival of the rest of the core stage components for Artemis 3 in the next few years, and will also await the arrival of the 4 RS-25 main engines for the Artemis 3 mission. Artemis 3 is 2 missions away in NASA's Artemis moon program because Artemis 1 is still in space. The Artemis 1 mission is an unpiloted test flight of NASA's Orion spacecraft, and that Orion crew capsule is on track for splashdown in the Pacific Ocean west of Baja California at around 12:40 p.m. Eastern Time, or 1740 UTC today. About 9 hours from now is when that spacecraft is set to splash down in the Pacific, where the U.S. Navy and NASA will recover it and bring it back to shore and ultimately ship it back or transport it back across the country to Florida for inspection and post-flight activities on that capsule. That activity here at Kennedy Space Center after the mission will include the extraction of some avionics boxes that will be reused on the next Artemis mission, Artemis 2, scheduled for launch in 2024. Artemis 3, that we talked about the engine section for a few moments ago, is scheduled for no earlier than 2025. Looking ahead for the next few days in terms of launches, here's a view of the launch schedule coming up for the next week. These are the launches that we have confirmed dates for right now. On Tuesday, December the 13th, there are a pair of launches scheduled. One will be the launch of an Ariane 5 rocket from the Guyana Space Center down in South America. This is the third to last flight of an Ariane 5 rocket, which has been a workhorse for the commercial space launch industry and the European space industry now for about 25 years. It'll be replaced by the Ariane 6, which is set to debut in late 2023. This Ariane 5 rocket will be carrying 3 satellites into geostationary transfer orbit. 2 of these are commercial communications satellites for Intelsat, Galaxy 35 and 36. The third satellite on this mission is MTG-I-1. That's Meteosat third generation imager number 1. It's the first in a new series or new generation of European weather satellites. Later that day, on December the 13th, Tuesday, Rocket Lab is scheduled to fly its first mission from U.S. soil. This mission of an Electron small satellite launch vehicle is set to take off from Wallops Island, Virginia, with a suite of payloads or small satellites for a company called Hawkeye 360. And then later next week, SpaceX has 2 more launches scheduled. On December the 15th, Thursday, at around 3:46 a.m. Pacific time, 6:46 a.m. Eastern, a Falcon 9 rocket is set to take off from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California with the SWAT mission. That's a joint NASA and French spacecraft that will be studying the ocean topography, ocean surface waves, and ocean height around the world. On the next day, December the 16th, SpaceX will be launching another mission from here at Cape Canaveral from Pad 40. This will carry the first 2 satellites for the O3b mPOWER constellation. This is a new generation internet broadband constellation that's been developed by SES. These 2 satellites will be heading into a unique medium Earth orbit, about 8,000 kilometers or 5,000 miles above the Earth. 2 of those satellites built by Boeing are on that mission December the 16th, scheduled for launch around 4:20 p.m. Eastern Time on December the 16th. So those are the launches we'll be covering over the next week or so. We'll be streaming live the Falcon 9 launch from here at Cape Canaveral, and we hope to be streaming also the Rocket Lab mission from Virginia on Tuesday. So we'll leave you with one last look from Kennedy Space Center, looking out toward Pad 40 a few miles away over at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where, again, to recap, the Falcon 9 rocket took off at 2:38 a.m. Eastern Time and has successfully deployed its 2 payloads, the Hakuto R moonlander for the Japanese company ispace, as well as NASA's Lunar Flashlight CubeSat mission to search for water ice at the lunar poles. So until next time, I'm Stephen Clark reporting live from Kennedy Space Center. Thanks for joining us.